Okay, the next item of business is debate on motion 17360 in the name of Tim Eagle on protecting Scotland's fishing industry. I'd invite members wishing to participate to press the request to speak buttons as soon as possible, and I call on Tim Eagle to speak to and move the motion up to 7 minutes. Mr Eagle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I made a promise, Presiding Officer, to members of my local fishing community while I was representing it as a councillor, that if I ever became an MSP, I would make sure to raise the subject of fishing. This promise I have already fulfilled, and I continue to do so willingly. Now, the thrust of this debate centres around worrying reports that the UK Labour government is preparing to trade away our country's fishing rights. Fishermen across Scotland are alarmed by this. I know this because I have had many get in touch with me. It has been widely reported that Labour's desire for a deal means that it has forgotten fishermen, which could lead them to making a new deal, including a multi-annual agreement and a freeze on quotas. That compares with the planned end of the Trading Cooperation Agreement next year, which would have brought annual negotiations and a significant transfer back of rights to the UK fleet. I am more than happy to give way right now if Scottish Labour front bench want to intervene and give the sector a full assurance that this is not true and will not happen. Thank you.
It is absolutely crass to suggest that fishing will be negotiated for national security. Surely the Minister recognises that. That's the premise of his debate. That's your motion. And I would ask you to recant and actually have a debate about fishing.
Through the Chair, please, Tim Eagle.
I think the member may need to read my motion. It doesn't mention defence. And nor am I going to mention defence in my speech. Others may, but I'm not going to, and I didn't for a purpose. Labour seem hesitant to really want to talk about the truth that they're selling out our fishermen. But if they had given us that assurance, this whole debate could have changed. I am acutely aware that there are differences of opinion, politics in this debate, that will no doubt come out today. But as this subject means so much to me, I'll try and counter them from the start. The SNP, and I see Angus Robertson is in the room, will probably want to challenge me on Brexit, ever the norm for the SNP. But are the SNP going to tell us what re-entry into the common fisheries policy would look like if they took us back into the EU? I doubt they can discuss it in depth, because the SNP would never secure a treaty change if, and I hope it never happens, an independent Scotland did rejoin the EU. In that scenario, the CFP would be back in full force, and I'll happily take the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank the member for taking an intervention. Perhaps he would like to read our paper on the marine economy and what that would look like in an independent Scotland as part of our Building a New Scotland series, and he would find out with great interest, I'm sure, as to the power and the position that we would have as an independent member state of the EU.
Tim Eagle.
I'll read less rhetoric from the SNP and listen more to my constituents who want out of the common fisheries policy. Labour will perhaps challenge me on the Brexit deal. Perhaps they will cry it could have been done better. I doubt it, judging by what we might be about to hear on the 19th of May when Sir Keir Starmer's planned UK-EU summit takes place in London. I want to say this before anyone else does. When the UK signed the Trading Cooperation Agreement with the EU, I believe it did not deliver a deal on fishing which met the expectations of the catching sector. But it did deliver two important things: withdrawal from the hated common fisheries policy and an opportunity to gain an even better deal in 26-27. For years, I have felt comfort in talking to fishermen that those twin gains were a given. Now, however, the Labour Party are putting those twin gains in peril. Scottish fishermen annually land over 500,000 tonnes, a value of £683 million in Scotland and a further £175 million landed abroad. But this is a sector that's not just about the economic contribution to Scotland, but the cultural one too. There is a rich and deep bond between the Scottish people and our natural assets, both on and offshore. For many, the connection with fishing is ingrained deeply with the collective memory of the generations of family members who have lived and worked with the sea. It's in the blood. Polling has been released today from the Scottish Fishing Federation, and I thank them for this work, which shows us almost 9 out of 10 Scots believe the UK should definitively control which vessels fish in its waters. 87% of people believe the UK should have full powers over which fleets fish in the UK exclusive economic zone. Just 3.2% disagree. And interestingly, even in the Central Belt, that figure is high. That should be a wake-up call to Scottish Labour to get down to London with a clear message. This deal cannot be made. We must protect our fishing industry. Several months ago now, I asked the SNP to bring a government debate on fishing, recognising there has not been one in over 2 years. That still has not happened. Now, I recognise the Cabinet Secretary answered to me before that this is going through the process, but what is taking it so long? Sadly, I don't have time to go into depth on other issues, such as the spatial squeeze, gill nets, IUU fishing, the ongoing discussions around inshore fisheries, scallop dredging and cockle closures. Nor do I really have time to touch on significant concerns around the function of Marine Scotland and marine protected areas. All these things solely lie in the control of the SNP government. But I do believe that, if not in this Parliament, certainly in the next session, a full, detailed review needs to be carried out on these areas. Worryingly, I have also heard reports from the government that the government are looking to cancel the contract for marine aeroplane surveillance from their base in Inverness, with very little time for any discussion. This could potentially cost a number of jobs and would be a big blow not just to Inverness Airport and jobs in the Highland, but to the fishing sector, who rely on these planes to monitor fishing in our waters. I have written to the Cabinet Secretary asking for an update on this, and if she can give us any answers in her speech, that would be great. Because, if true, it would be a shocking blow to marine protection in Scotland, and I call on the government to urgently rethink that decision. Presiding Officer, I would never consider asking France for 40% of their vineyards for a deal. Yet I enjoy their wine. The EU should not be asking us for our natural resources. It is time, finally, once and for all, to Britain to again have a prosperous, sustainable fishing industry in our hands, with us leading negotiations on access. It's time we stood up for our fishing sector, catching and processing, for our coastal communities and for all who know its rich history, because it is in Scotland's DNA. I move the motion in my name.
Thank you, Mr Eagle. I now call on the Cabinet Secretary to speak to and move Amendment 17360.3. Up to 5 minutes, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I just want to start, I would welcome Tim Eagle's recognition that the TCA did not deliver for the fishing sector. So perhaps then the Scottish Tories should have opened this debate by offering an apology to our fishing communities, given the harmful Brexit deal which they inflicted upon Scotland against our will. Far from delivering a sea of opportunity, they delivered the worst of both worlds, as was noted by the Scottish Fishermen's Federation. So coming to this chamber to pose as the champions of the fishing industry would be laughable if it wasn't so serious. The term brass neck springs to mind. Now, when it comes to the trade and cooperation agreement, benefits from it have been extremely limited. Moreover, the effects of Brexit represent permanent and ongoing barriers to trade that significantly impair the competitiveness of our seafood sector. Today, this government urges the UK Labour Administration not to repeat the failures of the previous UK government. A heavy price has already been paid, with the fishing industry impacted far worse than many others. The Scottish Government cares deeply about securing a prosperous future for fishing communities, seeking to deliver the best outcome for our fishing interests, both catching and processing. Now, when I addressed the Chamber on the 18th of February, responding to Beatrice Wishart's Members' Business debate, I emphasised that Scotland's fishing industry is ingrained in our national identity. It plays a vital role in Scotland's marine economy, and it's a significant aspect of the economic, social and cultural fabric of Scotland's rural, coastal and island communities. It's essential then that, as we face another milestone in the Brexit era, that the UK Labour Government hears what we in Scotland have to say. I remain frustrated and deeply disappointed that, despite a promise to reset relationships, my UK Government counterparts have not sought to engage on these matters, which are of such importance to Scotland. Now, one of this Government's priorities is driving economic growth. Fishing and our wider seafood sector is a key part of that. And as I've just outlined, this is one of Scotland's most important assets, our fishing industry, the people and communities who make a living from it, and its vital contribution to the Scottish economy. Now, the recent media coverage shows the lack of clarity in the UK Government's strategy as we lead up to the EU-UK summit on the 19th of May. Now, I appreciate that Rhoda Grant in her amendment states that speculation is unhelpful, but unfortunately the UK Government have left a complete vacuum on these issues that means there has essentially been no other option. And it doesn't help when UK Government ministers contradict each other in what they do say publicly. Now, stakeholders are blind, as are we, to what potential benefits may be sought by the UK Government, if any, and are left to worry over press statements and third-hand rumour. This is simply not good enough. We demand better for our fishing communities, given the disproportionate importance of fishing to the Scottish economy. Yes.
Briefly, Rachel Hamilton.
I appreciate the Cabinet Secretary's remarks, Presiding Officer, but I would like to ask the Scottish Government if they have reached out to the Labour Government to ask for a meeting to discuss these important plans for Labour to be conceding fishing rights to the EU.
Cabinet Secretary.
Unfortunately, the interministerial groups where we would hope to discuss these issues have been cancelled at the last moment for the past couple of months by my counterpart ministers in the UK Government, which is really unfortunate. But I'm hoping to have an opportunity to catch up with the UK Government next week, where I, of course, will use that opportunity to discuss that. Now, we need an agreement which delivers improvements for our fishing communities, and we also need the UK Government to provide Scotland with our fair share of funding for our marine economy and coastal communities. The UK Government has imposed a short-term Barnetized settlement, the complete opposite of what was called for by devolved governments across the UK. Baselining the marine funding allocation at the current 2014 figure of £14 million simply doesn't reflect the reality of funding requirements. And when you compare us to our neighbours in the EU, Denmark is an example, which has a similar population to Scotland, but both a smaller sea area and marine sector. They'll receive the equivalent of £25 million through the EU's current European Maritime, Fisheries and Aquaculture Fund. This post-Brexit power grab by the UK Government needs to be rectified as a matter of urgency. And the fact remains that we face a range of challenges arising from EU exit. These are permanent and ongoing barriers to trade that are significantly impairing the competitiveness of our seafood sector. Although the Trade and Cooperation Agreement avoided the imposition of tariffs, trade in seafood products with the EU is now subject to costly certification and inspection requirements, along with the ongoing threat of retaliatory tariffs to exports if the UK Government fails to meet relevant TCA obligations. And in terms of securing an uplift in TCA shares of fishing quotas, that is of course important and should always be based on zonal attachment, as in where the fish mostly are. But of equal importance is the sustainable management of these shared and jointly managed stocks for the long-term future. And in drawing to a close, Presiding Officer, I think I need to remind the Chamber that we are here debating a motion from a party which delivered a deeply damaging deal, one which was not in the Scottish national interest. And in the words of one former MP, the UK Government has delivered far less than I had hoped or expected. It would be easier to get someone to drink a cold pint of sick than to try to sell this deal as a success. The UK Government has a lot of work to do if it wants to meaningfully address the inadequacies of the TCA impacts, and we call on it to engage as a matter of urgency with the Scottish Government so we can work with it to address these matters and deliver for Scotland's fishing industry.
Point of order, Douglas Ross.
The point the Cabinet Secretary was making there is, I know the word I'm not allowed to use, is deliberately misleading and was referring to a very previous deal.
You are not allowed to use that terminology either, Mr Ross.
So I can't use lying or deliberately misleading?
No.
So what can I use?
It's not a point of order, Mr Ross.
Well, if the Cabinet Secretary has I said deliberately misleading, and I'm not allowed to use that either. But the Cabinet Secretary has deliberately used a quote that did not refer to the final deal on fishing for Brexit and made that claim that that was the opinion of the member who said it, myself, when it was not. And I don't know how that can be corrected on the record. And the Cabinet Secretary has deliberately tried to use a phrase that is not in context with this debate.
You have made your point, Mr Ross. It's not a point of order. Perhaps a debating point. I require the Cabinet Secretary to move your amendment, however.
Move the amendment, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I now call on Rhoda Grant to speak to and move Amendment 17360.1 up to 4 minutes. Ms Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I move, I move that amendment in my name. Presiding Officer, the Conservatives are so devoid of ideas that they're reduced to a point where they have to feed discord at everything they touch. The United Kingdom Government will, of course, hold talks regarding future working relationships and management of resources with European neighbours, and everyone knows those talks are scheduled to take place in May. But we all know that fish know no boundaries, and because of that, negotiations have always taken place on fisheries. No one can pretend that these have taken place in a way that works for the industry. Often these annual negotiations go down to the wire, where the industry does not know what their quota will be. A very quick intervention.
Briefly, Timmy.
Well, thank you. I'm just going to say on the negotiation side, does she agree with me that it is best to do annual negotiations, as was expected at the end of the TCA, rather than multi-annual negotiations, which is being rumoured under the Labour deal?
Rhoda Grant.
There is no deal. We will see what comes out, and we will have discussions around that when it happens. But certainly the way that the last Conservative government handled these negotiations did not work for the fishing industry. And it is surprising that they are then trying to defend that, because positive changes to those negotiations would be welcome, and it would give our fishing industry more certainty and security. And I don't have time to take another intervention. This Conservative motion seeks to suggest we need no change to the current system that they presided over. But, Presiding Officer, what is so much more concerning about this motion is that it seeks to conflate our national security and the security of the European continent with discussions regarding our working relationship with the European Union. Regardless of what happens in the talks at May, the United Kingdom need to work with the whole of Europe to protect our national interests in light of Russian aggression. It's essential for our shared security. It is in no one's interest that we do not work together. It's simply wrong to suggest otherwise, and it's crass to conflate our national security in the face of an aggressor with our economic well-being. The UK Government have made it clear that that will not happen. Presiding Officer, there are messages we as a Parliament need to send very clearly to the United Kingdom Government with regard to fisheries negotiations. We all understand the importance of fisheries to Scotland, and we need to encourage new entrants into the industry. It requires investment to set up fishing enterprises, so we need to create entrance-level opportunities. We all know that smaller boats retain more of their earnings within their community, and that's an excellent way to encourage new entrants. New entrants also need to be able to access quota. Therefore, new quota must be leased in the public interest, not sold to the highest bidder. We should build on the Shetland model, where quota is owned by a community and then leased to those who live in the local community and land their catches in Shetland. Orkney Council and Corley, Nanyel and Shear also do this with prawn quota, and this should be how we manage our quota going forward. It gives councils the ability to manage fisheries in a way that benefits local economies. Community wealth building in action, retaining the economic wealth of our fishing industries within our communities to make sure that we have the onshore as well as offshore benefits of fishing. All those things need to be discussed and put in place. But let us be clear, in this debate, it was the Tories who pushed for Brexit to take back control of fishing. And sadly, they had already allowed the sale of United Kingdom quota to foreign boats, sold to the highest bidder. Therefore, we will take no lessons from the party who created discord within Europe, our nearest neighbours, to cover their own incompetence, a party who sold out our fishing industry and who now seek to conflate national security with economic benefit.
Thank you very much. I now call on Ariane Burgess, who joins us remotely. Up to 4 minutes. Ms Burgess.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I just want to check, can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Thank you. Scotland's seas and the communities that rely on them are at a critical juncture, and the climate crisis has and will continue to heat our oceans, destabilising and damaging the building blocks that entire ecosystems rely on, and ultimately harming the livelihoods of fishers. At the same time, government is failing to adjust to this new reality and to deliver a viable future for the industry. We're already seeing the consequences of this situation. According to recent official statistics, 326 jobs on Scottish fishing vessels were lost between 2022 and 2023. And this came on top of the loss of almost 200 vessels in the North East and the Highlands and Islands regions between 2008 and 2022. The loss of just one vessel is enough to impact an entire community. So the human cost of the loss of 200 in little more than a decade is devastating for Scotland, not just in a social sense, but economically too. This situation should concern us all, and it tells us something about the status quo. It simply isn't working, not for fishers, not for communities, not for our precious seas. Neither today's motion or the amendments to it address this adequately, and the urgent need to move from extraction-based economy to a sustainable, regenerative one is what needs to happen. And what they all do is still back extraction at all costs. But that offers a boom and a bust scenario where we fish, fish and fish until there's nothing left. And I share some of the concerns included in the Conservative motion, namely that the UK government is planning to give the EU multi-year access to our fish stocks. While it is onerous, the current annual system of negotiations allows a near constant assessment of fish stocks that could be under serious strain and possibly decimation if there's no ongoing process of evaluation. But where I cannot support Tim Eagle's motion is where it gets into the weeds of Brexit. The Conservatives seemingly want to blame the common fisheries policy for all the ills of the fishing industry, and yet they forget conveniently that a Conservative UK minister, Boris Johnson, largely based the UK Fisheries Act on the very same policy they're trashing today. What would be more helpful for fishers is to focus on the delivery of the duties contained within that Act, which is where I turn to the Scottish Government. And although I agree that Parliament should have an annual debate and that Scotland needs a seat at the fisheries table, I do not accept the blame for the damage to our fishing sector sits entirely with the UK government. For years, we've had a series of ministers tell this Parliament that the fisheries management is complex. This is being used as an excuse not for doing the hard yards required to deliver the change that is needed. But the Scottish Government spends £80 million a year on marine space and fisheries. Where's the money going if it isn't overcoming the complexities that stand in the way of change? The Scottish Greens want to see a clear-cut policy that delivers for fishers and the environment that they operate within, which is why we want to see science-leading policy, a quota system that promotes low-impact fishing techniques and benefits Scotland's communities, and for the EU, UK and Scotland to come together to properly address overfishing. That way, we can deliver for coastal communities, the environment and the economy.
Thank you, Ms Burgess. I now call Beatrice Wishart again, up to 4 minutes. Ms Wishart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'm delighted that Tim Eagle is following my lead in bringing a fishing debate to the Chamber. Members will recall that in February I brought the first fisheries debate to Holyrood since 2022. The Scottish Government has simply not allowed for enough opportunities to speak on all that impacts our important fishing sector. I welcome calls for an annual debate on fisheries, though the sector is worthy of more than just one government debate a year, especially considering the significance of sustainable fisheries to Scotland's economy and coastal communities. We should recognise that we're talking about a high-protein, low-carbon food staple that is caught around our coast by one of the world's most dangerous industries, and it contributes significantly to food security. Fishing is also of cultural and social significance at home in Shetland, and it's important that generations of family ties to fishing are enabled to continue into the future. Indeed, we've already lost so many such ties and vessels in the fleet due to policy decisions. This afternoon, Scottish Liberal Democrats will not be supporting the Conservative motion. We won't oppose the Labour amendment. Whilst I note the clarification on the link with defence, which I'll expand on shortly, we are disappointed at the removal of the line about an annual debate. We will be supporting the Scottish Government's amendment. This afternoon's Conservative motion speaks of the relationship with the UK and the EU. My Westminster colleague Alistair Carmichael last week sought assurances that there would be no linkage between current negotiations with the EU on security and defence and those around future access to fisheries. The Minister responsible for negotiations confirmed during Cabinet Office questions in the House of Commons that there will be no such link, and he will be held to account for that commitment. It is critical that we listen to those in the fishing industry who feel that over the decades they've been sold out by successive UK governments, most recently by the botched Boris Brexit deal in 2021, which brought in new trade barriers. That's why colleagues in Westminster in the All-Party Parliamentary Group, co-chaired by MP Alistair Carmichael, have launched a call. I'm sorry, I've got no time. Have launched a call for evidence from the fishing industry and related stakeholders on their priorities for future fishing arrangements with the EU, ahead of the review of the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement and Adjustment Period on Fisheries ending in 2026. Cutting red tape on trade with the EU with a sanitary and phytosanitary agreement would help benefit the sector. Announcing polling data with strong public support for the sector ahead of the UK-EU summit in London on the 19th of May, Elspeth MacDonald, Chief Executive of Scottish Fishermen's Federation, said, "The Scottish public are crystal clear. Our fishing industry must not be sold short again." And she continued, "This poll confirms that Scots understand the value of fishing to our economy, our coastal communities and our national food security, and they expect their governments to stand up for those interests. With the Scottish public clearly supportive, our fishing sector can no longer be made to feel that policies enacted are to the detriment of their livelihoods and with little or no consultation." Before I conclude, Presiding Officer, I have long held and raised concerns about the resourcing of the Marine Directorate, given all that it's asked to do from patrolling Scotland's waters, research and analysis of data. Concerns continue that the checking of landings at Scottish ports by non-UK vessels are not scrutinised effectively at the expense of the Scottish fleet and accurate scientific data. And with increasing at-sea infrastructure as we transition away from legacy fuels, there needs to be a better communications channel for discussions about the impacts of offshore wind developments on traditional fishing grounds and nursery areas. I would urge greater engagement between stakeholders, Scottish Government and local fishing fleets about the reality of spatial squeeze to help ensure the future of Scotland's important fishing sector. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Wishart. We now move to the open debate. I call first Finlay Carson to be followed by Karen Adam. Up to 4 minutes. Mr Carson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The motion is clear. It's a call to safeguard our coastal communities. Reports that the UK Labour Government may agree a deal with the EU that enhances access for EU fishing vessels to the UK waters are deeply concerning. Such a deal, which could result in multi-year access guarantees, threatens to undermine the very future of our fishing industry. Scotland's fishing industry is hugely significant, not only contributing to our national economy but also sustaining our coastal towns and villages. It's imperative that every effort is made to support this industry during trade negotiations. Now, the existing fishery deal between the EU and UK, while not perfect, has taken our sector out of the hated CFP. It's also delivered increased access to UK fishermen to UK waters. The agreement for 2025 has secured 150,000 tonnes of fishing opportunities for the UK, which is a 15,000-tonne increase on 2024, ensuring sustainable fishing practices and the long-term viability of the UK fishing industry. However, the potential new deal proposed by the UK Labour administration represents a backward step for the sector, and we can't allow this to happen. Elspeth MacDonald, the Chief Exec of the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, has pointed out the absurdity of the UK Government caving into French demands for multi-year fishery deals with fixed quotas. Such a deal is just not a betrayal of our fishing industry, it's also a betrayal of our national interests. Public support for our industry is overwhelming. A Scottish Fishermen's Federation poll today revealed that nearly 9 out of 10 Scots believe the UK should definitively control which vessels fish in its water, and more than 80% think the EU fleet should not be granted continued access to the UK fishing grounds without tangible benefits being returned to Scottish skippers and crews. That means 80% of this nation expects their governments, both of them, to stand up for those interests. 86% of Scots think any future UK-EU fisheries deal should place Scotland's fishing industry at its heart. Even among younger Scots, often perceived as more Eurocentric, 65% of them believe the Scottish fishing industry should be prioritised in any future UK-EU agreement. Scotland's fishing industry lands 2/3 of all the fish and shellfish caught in the UK each year, making it the UK's powerhouse of seafood production. My hometown of Kirkcudbright has been the centre of the Scottish scallop industry, with West Coast Sea Products leading the way. And we mustn't overlook the importance of inshore fishing opportunities. Last week, my colleague Tim Eagle and I met with fishermen in Galloway, and one of the topics discussed was the cockle fishery. And I can already see the Cabinet Secretary cringing Before it was prohibited by this SNP government, it peaked in the early 1990s. The Solway produced more than 5,000 tonnes of cockles every year, worth over £5 million to the local economy. In 2023, Seascope Limited, in partnership with others, including the University of Glasgow and Marine Science Scotland, carried out research on cockle stocks. The results have been very positive, and a sustainable plan with partners from across business, academia and environmental organisations have put the plan forward, but still no satisfactory Marine Directorate response on the next steps in reopening the fisheries. But perhaps the Cabinet Secretary may be able to meet with representatives, or perhaps you might pull a cockle out of the bag today and inform us how we can move forward. The SNP have failed to make significant progress on improving inshore fisheries management, with a lack of scientific assessments hindering the development of these valued resources. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, the EU must follow on through the treaty it signed in 2020, which states that after 2026, access to waters become part of the annual negotiation on fisheries between the UK and the EU, and annual negotiations are into the international norm. If EU states want to keep benefiting from our rich fishing grounds, then that access must deliver clear and lasting benefits to Scotland's fishery. This Parliament must express its deep concern at the reported deal and stand firm in protecting Scotland's fishing industry. Let us have an annual debate on fisheries to highlight the importance to Scotland's economy and to ensure that our fishing industry, both offshore and inshore, is not only protected but championed as a vital sector.
Carson. I now call Karen Adam to be followed by Rachel Hamilton. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, it's hard to talk about fishing and the industry as a whole without talking about Brexit. And I find it quite insulting that at the beginning of the debate that it was set out that, oh, we might raise Brexit. Can I tell you, £100 million was lost in the first month of Brexit. People lost their livelihoods, families lost their incomes, coastal communities are struggling. All that does is invalidate it. Let's talk about it, find a solution. It's not, just stop the politicising. I represent one of Scotland's most iconic fishing communities, and I know only too well the frustrations there. I talk to fishers too. I represent Fraserburgh, Peterhead, Macduff and Buckie, and it's not just economic activity. Yes, I will.
Briefly, Jamie Harcourt-Johnston.
Thank you. I'm very grateful to the member taking the intervention. When she's speaking to those fishermen, as we all do as well, how many of them are telling her that they want to go back in the CFP as the SNP would have them?
Karen Adam.
I'll tell you what they're saying, and I mean, and you're welcome to come and join in these discussions with me as well. What they're saying is that that is wearing thin, that the mask is worn off, and they know that it was the UK government that were representing them at the table in negotiations that were making bum deals. So, the debate here, it does matter, but to protect the industry, we need more than debates. We need clear-eyed realism and workable solutions. And let me tell you, the fishing industry, yes, boats and quotas, but it's more than that. It's processors, it's engineers, harbour staff, lorry drivers, environmental officers, night watchmen, and so many others. And it all works hand in glove. And you can't talk about supporting the sector while ignoring infrastructure and the people who keep it going. And I'll be supporting the Scottish Government's amendment because it reflects something this motion misses. The decisions about Scotland's waters are still being made without proper consultation with the Scottish Government. And I was really sad to hear Tim Eagle saying that he didn't think we'd be competent in that scenario to be able to negotiate on our own. Yes, I will, but I've got a lot.
Carson, briefly.
It's all very well talking about the UK Government, but what is this Scottish Government doing to support inshore fisheries when we've got opportunities with sea bass, with cockles and extending lobster fishing, and they completely ignore it? The Marine Directorate have done nothing in the last few years to assist the inshore fishers.
Karen Adam.
I'm going to carry on with my speech here, but if the member wants me to go into that, I'm quite happy to talk to him after this about that, and with the Minister, I'm sure she is. So, the UK Government looks set to negotiate a multi-year access deal with the EU, and again Scotland risks being left out the room, and it follows a pattern from both Labour and Conservative governments in London. And I understand they're thinking about the UK as a whole, but that's the problem. We were told that Brexit was taking back control, but That control didn't come to Scotland, it stayed in London, which is just as far away geographically as far away in understanding what fishers of the North East actually need. Now, this motion focuses on what Labour might do, but ignores what the Conservatives already did. And it was the Tories who negotiated that deal. Labour may be carrying the baton, but it was the Conservatives that handed it to them. Perhaps Tim Eagle should have a word with his colleagues at Aberdeenshire Council, as local decisions do matter too. Conservative-led Aberdeenshire Council removed the night watchman service at Macduff Harbour. They didn't just cut a post, they put vessels, property and lives at risk. And you can't claim to protect the fishing industry in Parliament while stripping its support on the ground. As convener of the cross-party group on fisheries and coastal communities, I've worked with stakeholders across the board and I've invited members from all parties to contribute. Because if we want support for our fishers, we need to act, not just speak. Presiding Officer, I am here to represent. And I don't just want warm words, I want fair outcomes, and I'm willing to work cross-party to make that happen for the benefit of the people in my constituency of Banffshire and Bucking Coast. Debates are good, but what we really need is real power in the hands of Scottish fishers. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Adam. I appreciate the emotion in this debate, but just a gentle reminder around language being used. I now call Rachel Hamilton to be followed by Colin Smith. Up to 4 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I won't be using any words like bum. That's
not a good start, Ms Hamilton.
Our fishing industry is caught between two governments who consider them an afterthought, a chip to be bargained away to suit their own political interests. Just like the SNP, Labour's ambitions to do deals and cosy up with the EU puts the future of our fishing industry at serious risk. Whilst the latest data shows that Scottish vessels landed 683 million of sea fish and shellfish in 2023, an increase of 16% compared to 2019, the size of our fleet is currently in decline and employment on Scottish vessels has fallen by 13% since 2014. And whose fault is that? Labour's reported deal with the EU to hand away multi-year access to UK fishing water will further put pressures on our Scottish fishing industry. In February, Elspeth MacDonald from the Scottish Fishermen's Federation stated that the UK has the opportunity to do fisheries management better than the EU, more practical and appropriate to the UK situation. Any concessions on this would suck the UK back into even the outer reaches of the CFP's orbit, which would be significantly a backward step. Yes, I will.
Rhoda Grant, briefly.
Does Rachel Hamilton not recognise that fish don't know boundaries? We have to work with our neighbours to manage fishing stocks. We can't just simply go it alone.
Rachel Hamilton.
Yeah, I do realise I have eye-mouth in my constituency and I know how fish move. However, the Scottish Conservatives have not and will not be cosying up to the EU and will not be have any intention to go back into the CFP. We want autonomy for our Scottish fishermen and we want to support our Scottish fishermen, who are a hugely important sector in Scotland. I fully support the ability of the UK to determine its own fisheries management arrangements in UK water, and any deals that put this principle at risk would represent a betrayal of our status as an independent coastal state. We must ensure that any negotiations regarding fishing rights or defence remain separate and that there is no linkage between fisheries and access to markets. I would like to know if Anna Sarwar needs to stand up a bit more to President Macron rather than sidling up to Keir Starmer, who clearly wants to butter up the EU. But, Presiding Officer, Labour have also removed ring-fenced Scottish funding for agriculture and fisheries, and in typical fashion the SNP showed their disdain for fishing communities and took this as an opportunity to cut funding to the Marine Directorate budget in real terms between 2024-25 and 25-26. It's not only the Labour government that the fishing industry has to put up with. Closer to home, I will.
Very briefly, Cabinet Secretary.
Perhaps Rachel Hamilton would welcome the increase to the budget to the Marine Directorate in this current financial year.
Rachel Hamilton.
Of course, I would welcome an increase to the Marine Directorate budget, but the damage has already been done, Cabinet Secretary. Those decisions were weak. And Cabinet Secretary, at the time you were at the Cabinet table and should have stood up for the Scottish fishing industry. I couldn't say it in any other way, Presiding Officer. It was only after strong lobbying from the industry and the Scottish Conservatives that the SNP and Greens were forced into a rapid U-turn on HPMH, which would have shut off 50% of our Scottish seas and decimated the industry. Despite this U-turn and the strength of the voice from the industry, we are now seeing the SNP try to bring HPMAs through the back door. Presiding Officer, the SFF have also warned the industry risks being crushed by the so-called spatial squeeze. The spatial squeeze is having a massive impact on fishing, and the offshore wind projects, the marine conservation measures, are all restrictive regulations which are putting a pressure on Scottish fleets. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, my colleagues have highlighted the polling is clear. 4 in 5 Scots believe the EU should not be granted continued access to UK fishing rights. We're the only party defending the fishing sector in Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Colin Smith to be followed by Emma Harper. Up to 4 minutes. Mr Smith.
Presiding Officer, it's appropriate that the Conservative Party have brought forward a debate on the damage that can be caused if you have a botched deal with the EU, because, frankly, they are well qualified at delivering such bad deals. Not content with wrecking our economy through their economic illiteracy, not happy with putting party before country by calling the EU referendum in the first place, the Tories went on to deliver a Brexit deal that broke every single promise they made to the fishing industry. Fishers were promised a sea of opportunity. What they got was a wave of betrayal. Red tape, export chaos and continued EU access to UK waters without a meaningful better deal for our own fleet. And under Boris Johnson, the UK Fisheries Act was passed, a law that's frankly not that far removed from the common fisheries policy the Tories now say they oppose. How dare Conservative MSPs pretend to champion Scotland's fisheries when their party were the ones that sold out the sector? Our fishing communities from Peterhead to Eyemouth are vital to Scotland's rural and island economies. In 2023, Scottish vessels landed over 683 million worth of seafood. Now, I want to see that grow further, but many of those communities remain in the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. Why? Because the wealth isn't fairly shared. The outdated fixed quota allocation system allows a handful of big businesses to dominate, while smaller fishers and coastal communities lose out. Section 25 of the UK Fisheries Act says quotas should be distributed based on social, economic and environmental factors. But the Scottish Government still relies on a system that ignores compliance history, fails to incentivise low-impact fishing and overlooks illegal practices like illegal discards and modern slavery and human trafficking. In my own region, in Arran, victims were exploited aboard fishing vessels, a case that exposed the gaping lack of due diligence. When I asked the Cabinet Secretary in a number of written questions what checks were done before awarding quotas or grants, the answer was, we're continuing to look into this matter. Presiding Officer, that's not good enough. No business involved in abuse or illegality should be given access to our shared public resources, whether that's financial support through grants or valuable fishing quotas. We need reform. Quotas and grants should come with conditions to protect biodiversity, drive sustainability, protect workers and support local economies. The way we allocate quota arguably impacts as much as the level of the quota we negotiate itself. But yes, we do need better relationships with our neighbours to get the best deal from our fishers. That means building a stable and grown-up relationship with the EU, not one that's based on the paranoia and point-scoring of the Tories. There is, Presiding Officer, absolutely no basis for the media speculation of a link between fisheries and defence in current talks between the UK and the EU, and that's what prompted this debate. Presiding Officer, Scotland's fishing industry deserves better. It deserves serious leadership, not crocodile tears I think I'm probably winding up.
The member's concluding.
Okay, yeah. What we need is serious leadership, not crocodile tears from the party responsible for many of the current failures facing the industry. Today we should have had a debate on how we use the extensive powers this Parliament has to stand up for our fishers, reform the system and deliver a sustainable long-term future for this vital sector to Scotland's economy.
Thank you. We now come to the final speaker in the open debate. Emma Harper, again, up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Now, I agree with Tim Eagle when he expresses concern about the UK Labour Government's attitude to our fishing industry. I do fear that Scotland's fleet will again be hammered as a result of deals done by Whitehall behind closed doors. But the only reason these negotiations are happening at all is because Mr Eagle's former leader in Westminster gambled Scotland's fisheries and every other sector in our economy on a one-armed bandit Brexit referendum, only to lose and then swan off into the sunset while his successors carried out the act of dragging Scotland out of Europe against our democratic will. And they did a Brexit deal with the European Union that ended nearly 5 decades of international cooperation. Boris Johnson's trade and cooperation agreement means a quarter of the existing EU fishing quota in the UK and Scottish waters will transfer to the UK over just 5 years. Or to put it another way, one the Tories, I'm sure, will squeal from a sedentary position about, despite withdrawing from the EU, despite their mantra of take back control, and despite all their hot air and yittering on and blethering about the benefits of Brexit. And we need to pay heed that not all fishers wanted Brexit. Inshore fishers were pretty much opposed, as far as I understand. The EU fleet retains 75% of their quota in UK and Scottish waters, while the UK Government has zero say on the common fisheries policy. And from next year, it has to negotiate fresh access and share of quota agreements with the EU every year, but Westminster is desperately trying to avoid doing annual negotiations. Instead, the UK Government is setting up multi-year agreements. Now, the Tories have got what they wanted, the Brexit they hold so dear. Mr Eagle comes to this chamber and tries to hoodwink skippers in the fishing industry that his party is on their side. And was the common fisheries policy perfect? Of course not. One of Scotland's major barriers to the fairness under the CFP was the complete inertia and apathy shown by the UK Government every time quotas and take rates were up for negotiation. Yes, I will take an intervention.
Tim Eagle, briefly.
I suppose the question is, does the member accept that the SNP's policy would be to take us back into the CFP? And given that it is a treaty, how does she think the SNP will be able to negotiate with France and Spain to get a better than what was before? Because most fishermen I speak to do want out of the CFP.
Emma Harper.
So I'd welcome the thoughts of the member that Scotland would actually have its own voice at the table. They would be directly at the table. They'd be able to negotiate for themselves as a normal independent country. So we know the CFP wasn't perfect, of course not, and we know that some of the barriers under the CFP was the complete inertia, right? And I've just covered that. But ask the former skippers of Grimsby and Humber, who were sold out by the UK decades ago. Ask the fishermen of Cornwall, who have seen the supply chains to their most profitable markets in France and Spain torn asunder by a Brexit and the Tory omnishambles set in train by Boris Johnson. I recommend members read the Politico article headlined "How Brexit Betrayed the UK Fishing Industry." Here's a flavour of what it says about how supportive Tim Eagle's colleagues were of our fishermen. And here's a quote. When Johnson cited a rise in the numbers of Dover sole the UK trawlers could catch, fishermen pointed out this meant little to the Scottish industry, given the species are primarily found in southern UK waters. Boris Johnson wasn't across the details, said one attendee. He just could not comprehend that we weren't happy. So I'm conscious of time, Presiding Officer. A UK Tory Prime Minister who couldn't comprehend the needs of the Scottish industry and the Scottish workers. I'm shocked, Presiding Officer. The Scottish fishing industry deserves this Parliament's support. I think that it's time for Labour to be honest about the damage of the hard Brexit and instead stand up for Scottish fishing. And of course the SNP will do the very same.
Thank you, Ms Harper. We now move to closing speeches. I call first Ariane Burgess. Up to 4 minutes, Ms Burgess.
Presiding officer, we've heard many useful and colourful contributions today, and I'm pleased to note widespread agreement on the annual fisheries debate needing to be restored. And I just wanted to raise a couple of points of items I heard from the debate. I particularly appreciated Karen Adams' impassioned point about the impact of Brexit on our coastal communities and the broken promises and the devastating impact that that had on many people's lives. And Colin Smith also talked too about how too many coastal communities are communities that fit within areas of multiple deprivation. And in that light, I'd like to wrap up today by urging the Scottish Government to act, to use its devolved powers to protect our seas and our fishers, and to press the UK Government and the EU to be more responsible with how they approach negotiations. Scotland already has the powers to do a fair bit to change the status quo, and at present it puts quota in the hands of a small number of businesses who only have to meet a small number of obligations. What the government needs to do is to learn from agriculture and to make sure that we are using public assets to incentivise the changes we want to see for people and planet, not just pockets. We also need to put an end to bycatch. Every day, large volumes of fish and other marine wildlife are killed and then chucked back into the sea, and this damaging system needs to end. We can solve this by promoting low-impact fishing systems and introducing tighter regulations and harsher penalties. And it's the government's legal duty to end bycatch, and so is failing to act. Simply, this is not an option. We also need the Scottish Government to deliver on its legal duties to protect marine habitats, and I've lost track of the number of commitments made by SNP ministers to protect marine protected areas and habitats outside them. Their promises and the law are crystal clear on this. Action is needed to reduce the harms caused by certain fishing practices, namely scallop dredging and bottom trawling. The time for promises is over. Now it's time for long overdue action. Scotland's seas are a huge asset that can provide Scotland with huge social and economic benefits. But years of inaction and legislative failure have resulted in several severe harm and drastic decline in our marine environment. And this is holding us back from meeting our nature and climate targets, costing fishers jobs and ripping communities apart. Well-managed marine environments would reverse all of these trends and guarantee a sustainable future for Scotland's marine environment and all those communities that depend on it.
Thank you very much, Ms Burgess. I now call on Rhoda Grant. Up to 4 minutes, Ms Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start just by making a point of clarification in response to Beatrice Wishart's speech? She was concerned that our amendment appeared to take out the reference to an annual debate. And yes, it did, but the point being made by Beatrice herself was one annual debate really doesn't cut it, because there is more than one facet to the fishing industry. We need more than that. We need to look at how we add value to the processing industry, how we look at quota distribution, how we look at spatial planning. Karen Adam mentioned an awful lot more of the downstream industry. One annual set-piece debate doesn't do that. We need to put a focus on the industry and all its parts to make sure that we maximise the benefit, and that has been lacking, and I hope it's something we will look at again, especially things like spatial planning when we're looking at renewables and many of the other issues that are dealing with the marine environment. That has to be a priority for us. Presiding Officer, there is no deal. But a deal needs to be negotiated. It needs to be for the benefit of the fishing industry and indeed for the communities they support. We would expect trading in fish to be made easier, something again Beatrice Wishart talked about in her presentation, because there are the way current deals lie, there are huge disadvantages to our fishing community that need to be sorted out. So we look forward to seeing that and hoping that the Scottish fishing industry is in the heart of that, and obviously involving the Scottish Government as well. Others talked about research, and we know that our research needs to be improved. The Marine Laboratory needs investment. Some of the Rural and Islands Committee visited the laboratory and it looked pretty much like an old shed. It wasn't the place where we have cutting-edge science taking place. Because Ariane Burgess talked about climate change, and climate change does bring concerns, and we need to have research into the difficulties that that will bring. But it also brings other opportunities. As fisheries change, we need to be fleet of foot. We need to make sure we protect stocks while we are ready for new opportunities. Colin Smith talked about quotas and grants, and he was very clear, and I absolutely agree, that boats that break the law should not be given quota, and neither should they be given grants. Boats that disregard against the law, boats that trade in black fish, and indeed those who deal in modern-day slavery. It's abhorrent, and it should not be part of our fishing industry. We need to reform how we distribute quota to make sure that biodiversity is something that is taken into account, that we protect species, and that we make sure that those with access to our quota, our community quota, need to use it in the public interest and employ people fairly. Presiding Officer, the Conservatives brought forward this debate, and most of the issues here are because of Boris's broached Brexit bill. And it makes trading difficult, and we need to sort that out. This debate is on a false premise by a party who, to quote Colin Smith, promised a sea of opportunity and delivered a wave of betrayal.
Thank you, Ms Grant. And I call on Angus Robertson. Up to 5 minutes, Cabinet
Thank
Secretary.
you, Presiding Officer. And the global and geopolitical outlook that we face today has truly exposed the incredible act of self-harm that this government and the people of Scotland always knew Brexit to be. The force of global economic volatility, the spectre of US tariffs, simply reinforces more than ever the importance of Scotland having the security, the stability and the opportunity that comes with European Union membership. Scotland paid a heavy price for a Brexit it didn't vote for, and the fishing sector worse than many others. Salmon Scotland reported that Brexit cost Scotland around £75 million in 2023 in lost salmon exports to the European Union as farming companies face increased red tape and costs. Scottish Fishermen's Federation described the Brexit deal, and as I quote, as desperately poor, and said that it generated, I go on, I'm quoting, huge disappointment and a great deal of anger about the failure to deliver on promises repeatedly made to this industry. So whilst I welcome the UK Government's stated intent to improve relations with the European Union, and the Scottish Government will continue to engage proactively to seek improvements which can benefit Scottish people and traders, I deeply regret the fact that Scottish businesses, including the fishing sector, are no longer part of the largest single market and customs union on earth, or have the many benefits that come with freedom of movement within the EU. The fishing, I've got to make some progress, I will come to the comments of Mr Eagle in a moment. The fishing community finds itself in a predicament made for it by the UK Government, and the UK Government has severely limited the scope for progress by the red lines it has set itself for negotiating with the EU. Presiding Officer, the interests of Scotland are best served as an independent nation and member state of the European Union. Coming to individual contributions, I start with Tim Eagle, who began by acknowledging that the TCA negotiated by the Conservative UK Government did not deliver for fishing communities. Shame he didn't apologise for his party's sellouts, and we should never forget it was the Conservatives that signed the UK up to the Common Fisheries Policy. My Cabinet Secretary, I'm going to make some progress. My Cabinet Secretary colleague Mary Goujon updated the Chamber on cancelled meetings with her UK Government opposite number, and hopefully this will be rectified as a priority. Sadly, it reminds us more about poor relations with the last UK Government and not one committed to a genuine reset with Europe and devolved administrations. Rhoda Grant quite rightly warned about suggesting that fishing agreements have been reached. I'm not aware of that being the case, which is good if true, but I would welcome if she would encourage her UK DEFRA colleagues to meet with the Scottish Government. Ariane Burgess pointed to a loss of the fishing sector jobs since Brexit, which should concern us all, and Beatrice Wishart underlined the contribution of the fisheries sector in Shetland and Scottish coastal communities, and she raised something which I think has been missing in this debate, reference to the importance of an agriculture, food and drink agreement, an SPS agreement, which I would hope that everybody across this chamber would agree would be a beneficial part of a reset with the European Union currently being negotiated. Karen Adam reminded the Chamber about the scope of the sector and the needs of fishing communities that she so ably represents, and Emma Harper reminded the Chamber about how badly the fisheries sector is understood by both Tories and the Labour Party. Presiding Officer, in summary, it is beyond debate that key promises made during Brexit have not been delivered, and that Brexit has had significant impacts for Scotland's marine sector and our coastal and our island communities. This government will continue to represent the interests of this sector as it presses the United Kingdom government to move ever closer in its relationship with the European Union until such a time as we can once and for all reverse the folly of Brexit and rejoin the European Union as an independent member state.
Thank you, and I call on Jamie Halker-Johnston to wind up.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm very sorry that the Cabinet Secretary didn't take an intervention, because I was going to point out to them that the 5th of May is a very special day for us, because it's the day that he and I stood against each other in the general election. And who'd have thought that nearly 20 years ago we'd both be in this place, me representing a party that took us out of the CFP and him representing one that wants to take us back in. Can I firstly draw members' attention to my register of interest? I'm pleased to be able to close what has been an important debate on the future of Scottish fishing, an industry that is vital and so ingrained in many of the communities that I represent across the Highlands and Islands, including in Mallaig, on Skye and, of course, in Orkney, where I live, and in Shetland, where Tim Eagle and I visited and spoke with the local sector only last month. And as Tim Eagle and others have highlighted, the Scottish Conservatives have chosen to use our business time today to bring a fishing debate in Holyrood after the SNP Scottish Government failed to do so. There's not been one for 2 years, and it's clear from the many contributions today that this is a shameful failure by the SNP. Their amendment actually supports calls for an annual debate, which rather begs the question, one which could be asked of the SNP in so many areas, why the delay? Our fishing industry is a vital employer in our coastal and island communities and supports so many local jobs and livelihoods, both directly and indirectly, across my region. But there are a number of challenges that the industry faces, some of which were raised with us when we were in Shetland and also in meetings with the Scottish Fishermen's Federation. Most pressing are reports that the UK Labour administration seem prepared to bow to pressure from the French government and sell out Scotland's fishermen for access to EU funding. If true, that really would be a betrayal of our fishermen, giving away access to our waters and our fish just to appease a French president who appears to be shamefully exploiting European security concerns to his own ends. Reacting to reports of a deal, James Anderson, chairman of the Shetland Fishermen's Association, said, and I quote, "If true, these reports, the report is more or less suggesting that the UK returns to being in the much maligned common fisheries policy, with a multi-annual deal condemning us to fixed quotas year after year. Ministers clearly haven't got a clue about the impact on Scottish fishing grounds and the people whose livelihoods depend on them, or they would not be agreeing to this as a way forward. Food security should be part of our national security, and the interests of one industry should not be traded off against those of another, no matter how small." Now, Labour's amendment claims that no agreements have been reached, and therefore speculation is not helpful, or perhaps not helpful for Labour. And can we really take them at their word? Ahead of last year's general election, Keir Starmer told farmers food security is national security. He reassured them that they had his support. Losing a farm is not like losing any other business. It can't come back. Labour was right behind our farmers, he suggested. Then he betrayed them by introducing Labour's family farm tax. Labour went from supporting our farmers to cutting the legs from underneath them. They'll just have to learn to do more with less, Labour said. Farmers have learned to their cost that you can't trust Labour. Fishermen may be about to learn the same. Of course, the SNP's amendment is as expected. It cuts out any awkward references to the common fisheries policy, clearly in the hope that Scottish fishermen would somehow forget that the SNP's obsession with breaking up the UK and rejoining the EU would also mean rejoining the common fisheries policy. The SNP are desperate to hand back control of our seas and our fish to bureaucrats in Brussels. I will take an intervention.
Karen Adam.
I thank the member for taking an intervention. I'm just wondering, could you tell us how Brexit has remedied coming out of the CFP?
Jamie Halcroft-Johnston.
We were just talking actually about the opportunities that have been presented to us that I think Labour are going to throw away, but I'll come a little bit more to it later. Leaving the CFP has been a positive move, but I also recognise, as Tim Eagle did, industry concerns over the limitations of the deal agreed with the EU as we left. And that brings me on to some of the other contributions today. Tim Eagle rightly recognised the concerns of some in the fishing industry, concerns raised with me at the time as the party's lead on fishing as we left the EU, that the trade and cooperation agreement with the EU that was signed did not meet the expectations of many in the sector. But he's also right that it delivered two important things: that we left the hated CFP and we built in an opportunity in 2026-27 to get a better deal. And that is what Labour now threaten. But the threat is from the SNP too, back in the CFP if the SNP have their way, as I've just mentioned. But Rachel Hamilton also reminded us it was SNP ministers here in this place who, egged on by Fergus Ewing's favourite nationalist colleagues, the Greens, planned to bring in HPMAs which would have shut 50% of Scottish seas and decimated our coastal communities. Thankfully, after pressure from these benches, the industry and local communities, they were forced to U-turn, although the threat of HPMAs by the back door remains. Finn Carson highlighted the historic importance of his local cockle fishing industry, and that resonated particularly with me. As we see time and time again local fisheries closed or blocked because of questionable science or prevaricating ministers. That is certainly the case with the closures of the Clyde Cod Box, and a derogation to catch squid for Shetland fishermen wasn't granted because, and I paraphrase the response I received, there wasn't enough evidence to allow it, but there also wasn't enough evidence to reject it. Valuable local fisheries, often worth millions of pounds to local economies, being lost, sometimes year after year, because of the decisions made on questionable science or decisions not being made at all. If I've got a little time.
Finlay Carson.
I appreciate my colleague giving way. Would you agree with me that perhaps the reason we've not had a fisheries debate in this chamber is not because SNP don't like to give up the chance to kick the UK government, it's because they would absolutely fail to defend their position in supporting their inshore fisheries and the devolved fisheries regulations, whatever, that they are wholly responsible for and have let the fishery industry down in Scotland since they came to power.
Jamie Halcroft-Johnston.
Well, the member in the chamber will not be surprised to know that I agree with him wholeheartedly on that point, and we've seen time and time again. Others spoke on some of the other challenges the industry faces, including spatial squeeze, an issue of increasing concern for many fishermen. However, the threat the sector now faces from Labour government's potential deal with Brussels is grave. It would be a sellout of local fishermen and our fishing communities. Presiding officer, polling released by the Scottish Fishermen's Federation is clear. The Scottish public overwhelmingly believes that the EU fishing fleet should not be allowed access to our waters without tangible benefits to Scotland's fishermen and our fishing industry. And by supporting the Scottish Conservative motion unamended at decision time today, this Parliament can send a clear message that it opposes Labour's damaging deal, that it confirms its support for Scotland staying out of the CFP, and that our future must be one as an independent coastal state and not one controlled by the EU bureaucrats in Brussels. And that both of Scotland's governments must get behind our fisheries sector and work together to deliver a bright future, a future that we know it can all have.
Thank you, Mr Halcroft-Johnston. That concludes the debate on protecting Scotland's fishing industry. It's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is consideration of Business Motion 17377 in the name of Jamie Hepburn on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme. And I call on Jamie Hepburn to move the motion.
I'm happy to move this motion, Presiding Officer, which adds the Programme for Government statement to the schedule next week. Some members will be interested to be aware that, unlike other years, there will be the opportunity to ask questions of the First Minister following his statement. Then it will be followed by a debate in the usual fashion. Then, of course, another programme for government debate the following day. Members also might like to look further ahead to see the following week, 13th of May, when we will be having the Stage 1 debate on the assisted dying for terminally ill adults Scotland Bill followed by Conservative business, the following day then Scottish Government business, the following day. That's probably as much as I can extend in terms of the business motion, which I'm happy to move.
Thank you, Minister. No member has asked to speak to the motion. Therefore, the question is that motion 17377 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed. The next item of business is consideration of business motions 17378 to 17381 on Stage 1 timetables for bills. I ask any member who wishes to speak to the motions to press their request to speak buttons. And I call on Jamie Hepburn on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau to move the motions.
Happy to move these rather quicker than the last motion I moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. No member has asked to speak to the motions. Therefore, the question is that motions 17378 to 17381 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motions are therefore agreed. And the next item of business is consideration of 4 Parliamentary Bureau motions. And I ask Jamie Hepburn on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau to move motions 17382 and 17383 on approval of SSIs, 17384 on designation of lead committee, and 17415 on committee meeting times.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. And the question on these will be put at decision time, and there are 7 questions to be put as a result of today's business. And can I remind members that if the amendment in the name of Jim Fairley is agreed to, the amendment in the name of Claire Baker will fall. The first question is that Amendment 17362.4 in the name of Jim Fairley, which seeks to amend Motion 17362 in the name of Sue Webber on ending the war against Scotland's motorists, be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. Yes. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote and there will be a short suspension to allow members to access digital voting.